Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Mask, and today I'll be presenting my work, The Consequences of Immigrating During a Recession, Evidence from the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. To tell you a bit about myself, I am a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Economics at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I do plan on going on the job market next year. It's a bit ironic to say that, however, given current economic conditions, because actually what I study is scarring, or the long-term consequences of entering the job market during a recession. So as you can see in this picture, you can imagine these are five people, waiting for a job interview, sitting outside of a job interview waiting. You can imagine maybe in a good period during a boom times, maybe it's only one or two people that are competing for this job. But perhaps during a recession, it's 5, 10, 15, 20 different people competing for the same job. And you can imagine how that would affect your ability to negotiate a salary, or even to find a position that really fits your experience. So the term has, I guess, in the earlier literature kind of covered unemployment spells on long-term labor outcomes. More of the contemporary literature, the literature since the early aughts, there was a couple of papers by Paul Oyer, a paper by Lisa Kahn, and a paper by Philip Oriopoulos and co-authors that looked at what happens when you enter the job market during a recession, particularly when you graduate during a recession. So I'm just kind of following along that in the literature. I have 3 papers related to this topic. I have one paper that looks at a new law that actually bans discussion of salary history in the job application process, and seeing if that possibly mitigates this effect. I have another paper that proposes some alternative ways to measure this effect. But what I'm going to be talking to you about today is this effect, this concept of scarring in the context of migration. So what do I mean by that? So it's the paper is asking a pretty straightforward question. If someone moves to the US during a recession, does it affect their wages or employment over the long term? What I find is that for every percentage point increase in the arrival national unemployment rate, so that would be the economic conditions that a person faces as they enter the country, for refugees, their wages are decreased by 1.67%, and their employment probability is decreased by about 1.16 percentage points after 5 years. So to put all this in context for the individual refugee, the employment probability, while being an interesting measure, may not be a big thing in absolute terms. For a refugee, it would mean like, you have a 60% chance of being employed after 5 years. It may be, you come in during a recession, you have a 59% chance. But the wage scarring aspect is very substantial. You could think about a refugee who's coming to the United States, in a good time, normally they would make $15 an hour. But because, they're entering the country during a recession, for every percentage point increase in that unemployment rate that they face, it's about $600 less that they're making each year. You can think about, in the current context, the spread between January and April of this year. And most macroeconomists are predicting an unemployment rate of 20% in the United States. A change from 3 to 17, or 3 to 20, that's a 17-point spread. Now that refugee is going to be making about $10,000 less. So it's a very substantial effect. So why do I study refugees? Well, for most migrants, it's hard to estimate this effect, because most migrants are may sort of game their timing of coming to the United States based on economic conditions. So a great example is, since the 80s and 90s, immigration to the United States from Mexico has typically been a positive, and more people coming than leaving. But in 2009, that actually flipped. There was more people leaving the United States to go back to Mexico. And that was all because of economic conditions in the United States. There weren't job opportunities. People, had to make ends meet. So you think about all these groups that can potentially gain their migration based on economic conditions. I chose refugees because they cannot. Refugees are subject to a variety of institutional constraints that I'll get into later. But probably the principal reason is that even if they were able to sort of move up to the front of the line, they still got to wait 18 to 24 months before they can actually come into the United States, because they have to do pre-arrival screening, which involves a background check, interviews with neighbors, medical screening, things like that. So this paper kind of follows a literature that was started by Barry Chiswick back in the 70s. More recently, there were papers by Olaf Asloon and Dan Ruth, Anna Godoy that look at refugees. Asloon looks at Sweden, Anna Godoy looks at the Netherlands, and I look at the United States. If you had the pleasure of tuning in earlier this week to the senior seminar, Andreas Steinmeier, Kaman Barsby, and Christoph Winter have a paper where they actually look at this question in the context of family migration. That's all to say that I think there's plenty of potential in this area. This is a kind of an understudied subject, and I think tell us a lot about understanding differences between immigrant groups over time. So there's definitely a lot of areas for research in this. So it's great to see that we're starting to see that. All right. So to kind of drive home the point that I think that refugee immigration is not tied to economic conditions. In this graph, you can see so the x-axis is basically worsening economic conditions. As the x-axis increases, that is you see a higher unemployment rate in the arrival year. So I'm basically just taking the totals for refugees for each year and then plotting those against the unemployment rate that was observed for those years, and also doing that for total immigrants. So what you see here is that for all immigrants, there seems to be a negative relationship. So as the economy is declining, as economic conditions are getting worse, you see less and less immigration, or total immigration. So if you were just to run a linear regression through this, you could see for every percentage point increase, there is about 100,000 less migrants coming into the United States. However, for refugees, there doesn't seem to be a relationship. And I'll get into in a minute why that is. But refugee migration always in the United States has been, at least up until recently, has been typically between 50,000 and 200,000. But that change doesn't seem to be correlated at all with economic conditions on the ground. It has more to do with the general need, I guess politics probably plays some role in that as well, but it doesn't seem to be tied at all to the unemployment rate in the arrival year. Okay, so and also I was gonna say in the paper, I do this in logs because it's a little easier to see the spread of refugee migration when I use logs, but the relationship is the same. All right, so just kind of give you just a broad overview of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. So most U.S. resettled refugees first apply to the UN High Commission for Refugees. There are a few that may, like a persecuted minority within a country, that has diplomatic relations with the United States, maybe that would apply directly through the U.S. Embassy. But by and large, these are people that are going to be applying through UNHCR. That process can be anywhere from 2 to 10 years, depending on circumstances. You can imagine, for a refugee that's fleeing their homeland and, having, to survive in a refugee camp, this could take a very, very long time. But regardless, if you are selected to come to the United States, the State Department within the United States works with 9 different volunteer agencies. They're called BOLOGs in a lot of government literature. And these volunteer agencies help to resettle the accepted refugees. So if a refugee has family in the United States, typically they'll try to place them near the family. If not, then that placement is determined by availability of resources between these agencies. So that's kind of a semi-random process. I will note that family does not influence the timing of when you come to the United States. You don't have any special advantage if you already have family in the United States. And even if you did, you still are going to be subject to that 18 to 24 month delay while they're in the pre-screening. Okay. Also want to note that refugees are allowed to move to different states, but that could be contingent on them potentially losing benefits that they may have depending on the state that they're moving to. All right, sorry for the resolution in this picture, but it's broadly, I just wanted to show you that refugee resettlement in the United States is pretty diverse. Basically every urban center in the United States is covered, and refugees are resettled, and most, relatively spread out throughout the United States. All right, also want to note that in this study, I want to make very clear that I'm looking specifically at refugees. So refugees, in this context, I'm thinking of refugees that apply from afar and then go through this formalized resettlement process. Asylees are a different group. You could think about people that are coming to the border to request entry into the country. that, could potentially be gained by economic conditions. So I want to make sure that, what I'm talking about are the people that apply from afar and have to wait and are subject to the whims of the institutions in the United States before they can actually migrate over here. And again, that process can take many, many years. All right, so now I want to go over the conceptual framework.
There is just a question. Somebody's asking what are the conditions under which the refugees are selected to come on the US, and has this changed over time? Is it time varying?
Say it again.
So what are the conditions under which refugees are accepted to come to the US, and whether these conditions have changed over time?
They have. They don't seem to be related to economic conditions. A lot of, I guess a more recent example, as you can see, refugee resettlement in the United States is significantly dropped. A lot of that is being motivated by politics within the country. The president every year decides how many refugees come into the country, and also from which regions of the world that they come from. By and large, I would say in the 80s and 90s, this program was probably more viewed as a humanitarian, so there's probably less political influence. But as of recently, that seems to be the key driver. But it does not seem to have any sort of relationship with the economic conditions of the country. Okay? Okay. So to walk you through the conceptual framework, so there's a lot of different ways you can think about what would cause scarring to occur. So there's two examples I like to think of that really help me kind of walk or think through how this might work. The first is in a paper by Bader and DiNardo in 1991. They talk about the difference between a spot labor market and a contract labor market. So a spot labor market is supply and demand. Your wages at the time that you take a job are completely contingent on the number of workers and the number of jobs available. As economic conditions improve, that wage that you potentially could change, and you'd be able to negotiate yourself into a better wage. In that model, you would not expect any sort of long-term divergence between people that enter the country in different economic conditions. However, if you were subject to contracts, whether implicit or explicit, and that your wage was tied to when that contract was signed, if you're not able to move out of your job post economic conditions improving, then you could see a long-term divergence between those two groups. Another way to think about it, and this was described in Lisa Kahn's paper in 2010, so this is the idea of human capital accumulation. And for this, I like to use myself as an example. So I'm going on the job market this year. And let's say that the naysayers are absolutely correct and there are absolutely no jobs available. So I go on the job market, there's no government jobs, no academic jobs, no jobs. So, I'm stuck, and I still have to make ends meet. So I have, 5-6 years of applied economics training, but I'm not able to use that. So let's say I take a tutoring job. Nothing's wrong with tutoring, but because tutoring is not paying me very well, I have to spend a lot of hours doing it, and I don't have time to teach. I don't have time to do research, and I certainly don't have time to do presentations like I am doing with you today. So you can imagine in two different scenarios, one where I'm graduating during a good year, and one where I'm graduating a bad year. In the good year, let's say I did get an academic job, and I have 2 or 3 years where I'm able to write papers, present, teach, build up my resume. When the counterfactual world, I'm not able to teach, I'm tutoring. So then I don't have all these things to build up my resume. So when I, let's say I go on the job market in 2024, those two individuals are going to look very different. So it's all to say that human capital accumulation, it's not necessarily, I would say, firm-specific human capital, but more industry-specific human capital. But those things that you would potentially learn after school, a lot of these individuals aren't able to take advantage of, and that can affect their trajectory in their career over the long term. All right. So to kind of give you just an overview of the data that I use in this study. So the data is pretty exciting because it's, to my knowledge, it's the only US refugee data set that actually covers refugees for longer than 90 days. So my data set actually covers them for 5 years. And the way it works is every year, roughly 1,500 households are added. And at the end of the 5, so then they're followed, each subsequent year up to 5 years. Then after the 5th year, they're dropped. So at any given time when the survey is done, have people that have arrived at different periods of time. And the group that has been here the longest, has been here for more than 5 years, they're no longer surveyed. In total, I have about 17,771 refugees who resettled to the United States between May 1988 and May 2004. And to kind of give you an idea of how this data looks, so I break up the data based on year of arrival to kind of give you just a sense that, you know, refugee migration in the United States kind of comes in waves. So in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of refugees were coming from Southeast Asia. Starting in 96 or in the latter part of the 90s, you started to see a lot more European refugees, particularly after the break of Yugoslavia. And then also during that time, I would say between the late 90s and early aughts, you also started to see more immigration or more refugee immigration from sub-Saharan Africa. So most of the covariates look similar over time. The years of education, gender ratio, and age seem to be pretty consistent. But I do notice that in later years, you know, more people are fluent in English when they arrive. There's less people that are disabled when they arrive. Marriage rates seem to be similar, and children seem to be a little bit higher. So all this to say, you know, when I'm thinking about the timing of when they're coming, I would be concerned about this. But what I do in the papers, I show, you know, once I control for country of origin, a lot of these differences go away. So, you know, what's driving these changes in the sample over time are these country differences. So a key control that I want to use. All right, so to kind of give you a broad overview of my empirical strategy, I first want to state exactly what I'm assuming. So broadly, I'm saying that refugee arrival dates are plausibly exogenous to the economic conditions. So the belief that there's no reason to believe that, you know, if a country is about to enter a recession, that a refugee is either not going to come or, you know, try to delay that in some way, or would be able to delay that. And the reason why I don't believe this is because first, the idea of return migration is not much of an issue with this group. The whole idea of being a refugee is typically that you're not able to stay in your country of origin. So you know, I don't have to worry so much about, particularly in a short time period, but, you know, the first 5 to 10 years, I don't have to worry too much about these refugees going back to their country of origin. There's also the case that they cannot easily migrate between countries, and that's true even before they get resettled somewhere. But I'm thinking of this more in the context of if you were to get resettled in the United States, it's probably not likely that you're going to be immediately moving to another country because you're going to be subject to a lot of constraints during that period. That's also to say that refugees are not able to choose where they are resettled. So, you know, refugees will apply to the UNHCR, and then their ability to actually come to the United States is going to be determined by the authorities in the United States. You know, this presidential report that comes out every year and the president signs, that will help determine whether or not you're actually even eligible to come. So that's all to say that even if they were able to gain this somehow, you're still going to have to go through this 18 to 24 months of pre-arrival screening. So that, you know, even if you were able to get to the front of the line with all these other ones, it would be hard to gain your arrival towards economic conditions on the ground because you're still going to have to wait to be approved. So I use this institutional feature in a fixed effects model, nothing fancy, just exploiting the potential or plausible exogeneity in this arrival date. So I treat the both log wages and employment probability on the monthly national unemployment rate that each refugee faces at arrival. To kind of give you an understanding of what I'm attempting to do in this regression, I first just want to show you just a picture of what happens if I was to split the sample based on arrival national unemployment rate. So the blue are the below median. That's the people that were to be arriving during good times. The red triangles are the above median. That's the group that would be arriving during a recession, during tougher economic times. And what we see in the first graph is that employment probability for those who arrive during good times is you know, much more than those who arrive during bad times. It eventually converged by the 5th year, but there's a lag in, you know, the people that are arriving during bad economic times to catch up with those peers. You see with wages, there seems to be a consistent throughout the entire 5-year period split between the two groups. And then the bottom two graphs are talking about social welfare. So something that's unique about refugees in the United States that's not the case for most immigrants is that they are actually able to have access to welfare programs, whereas most immigrants in the United States don't have access to those until after 5 years. And again, so AFDC and TANF is a temporary assistance for needy families. This is kind of like a cash assistance program for parents. You can see that those who arrive during adverse economic conditions, have to use this program more. And also SNAP, which is a food voucher program, you can see that those individuals also are taking up more SNAP benefits during this time. Okay, so
Joshua?
the problem.
Yeah, there is just one more question. Somebody's asking, given that following the rules of the UNHCRs, refugees can state preferences of where they want to go, and whether do you think there may be a possibility that they list lower preferences for the US when there is an economic crisis in the US, whether this is a possibility?
Well, the problem is they would be filling out these forms presumably 2 or 3 years prior, right? So, if you were saying, I don't want to come to the US during a recession, well, the recession won't be the case 2 years later. So
right.
It's really, the gaming is going to be based on economic conditions. That would be kind of the concern. But another concern, so in this graph, I'm not controlling for anything. I'm not controlling for country of origin or anything like that. But I'm also not controlling for subsequent economic conditions. So what I'm trying to do in this regression is make sure that I'm comparing individuals from the same country, the same demographic type, things like that. But I'm also controlling for current economic conditions. So the variable of interest, this beta 0K, I do this in 2 ways in the paper. One, I just regress on just this without an interaction term, just to see if there's any, what is the effect of just the unemployment rate. Beta or phi K is it's a fixed effect for years since migration. So you can think of it kind of like experience. Sorry, it's hard to write on here. I use a variety of controls. So I control for age, disability, English ability at arrival, years of education, marital status, parental status, and gender. And all these variables are based on what was observed when they first came into the United States. Additionally, I also control for country of origin. So that's this phi C. And phi K, which again is the experience variable. And then the subsequent economic conditions, this phi T and this variable, that's the contemporaneous placement state unemployment rate. Basically, the idea here is that you can imagine a recession working like this, where the unemployment rate's around 3 to 4%, and then you have this huge spike and then a long recovery. Well, the problem here is that, if I'm looking at, say, an unemployment rate of 7, that could represent 2 periods. It could be here or here. Now, you can think about entering the job market. Those are 2 very different times. Here, there's a lot of uncertainty. In the first one, there's a lot of uncertainty. People aren't necessarily going to be hiring as much. Maybe in the second period, they're hiring more because they're seeing that the economy is back to recovery. So I want to make sure that I'm only comparing individuals to, that are entering the country based on economic, or not entering the country based on economic conditions, but also that there's subsequent, economic, the subsequent outcomes are not going to be affected by economic conditions that are changing after they enter the country. All right, to get to the results.
And are all of the controls measured at arrival? So the controls that you're adding in the regressions?
Yes. So, that's very, very good point. So yes, with the exception of age obviously increases as time goes on. But disability, English ability, your education, your marital status, and your parental status, all those are going to be based on when you first arrived in the United States. So to kind of give you an understanding of the main results that I find in the paper. So column 1 is going to be just a regression of this unemployment rate at arrival with all the controls on employment and wages. And what I find is that on average is about a for every percentage point increase in the national unemployment rate, there's about a 1.39% reduction in employment. In the second column, I stratify this effect over the 5 years that I observed these refugees, to kind of give you an idea of how this changes over time. Something you might find curiously is this is actually positive, and I'm going to go into in a minute why that is. But by and large, for the most of the period that I observed these refugees, it's going to be a negative relationship. The third column is, again, like the first column. I'm just regressing on the unemployment rate at arrival first, just to see the general effect. I find that wages do increase over this period by, for every percentage point increase in the national unemployment rate, there's a 1.66% reduction in wages. And then again, when I stratify that over the 5 years, I see that it's a pretty consistent effect over the 5 years. Similar to what we saw in the graph, I guess, earlier. Okay. So to kind of give you an understanding of what's going on with this positive employment that we observe in the first year, when I split the sample by gender, and then in the paper I actually split it even more by gender and education level, I find that most of this positive effect is going to be driven by female refugees, particularly the female refugees that have less than a high school education. And the reason why this is you can think about most of these individuals that are coming to the United States are coming in nuclear family units, so husband, wife, and children. Typically from traditional societies, so the expectation, may be that the husband would be working once they come to the United States. But you can imagine in adverse economic conditions, maybe that individual can't find gainful employment or can't find a job that pays well enough. So you may have this, motivation for the female refugees to also enter the labor force, and that's what I'm observing. The unfortunate part is that doesn't seem to persist. So in later periods, we actually see that relationship reverse. So it really seems to be only this first year that we see this. But in terms of wage scarring for both groups, seems to be consistent throughout the period. I also look at welfare utilization. So again, like I was telling you earlier, AFDC and TANF, these are cash assistance programs. AFDC is actually the program prior to 1996, the law changed and they changed it into a state block grant program. It's similar goals, but the way the funds were administered changed. But by and large, what's interesting about this graph, so also in columns 3 and 4, I'm looking at food vouchers. But what's interesting about this graph is this first year. So I don't really see much evidence of an increase in uptake of these services, except maybe in year 4 with food vouchers. But I do observe for both benefit programs that there is a marked decrease in utilization of these programs in the first year. And that may also contribute to why you see an increase in labor force participation by female refugees. But what I think is going on here, so refugees are afforded cash assistance up until about 8 or 9 months post-arrival. It's this program called Refugee Cash Assistance. And what happens is after the 8th or 9th month, they've got to switch over to state benefits. So that if you're still unemployed or you still don't have enough income, and you're going to need assistance, then you're no longer able to get the refugee cash assistance. You've got to start applying through the welfare programs in your state. And I think what's going on is it's simply just a delay. So, I look at this further in the paper, it's really only the last 3 months. So you lose your refugee cash assistance in the 9th and 10th month. It's really that 3-month period that you're seeing a marked decrease in utilization. After that, everything seems to stabilize, and you really don't see a difference between the two groups. And you can think about the comparison here would be essentially the same as the median and above median and below median unemployment groups. I'm just making a comparison with controls, for any potential confounders in that. Okay.
There is one question related to the table, and also you have 5 minutes. So the question is, if the positive effect in the first year was driven by female, then we would expect a negative effect for male on the welfare program. And why do you think it's not the case?
So welfare, I actually have to only measure at the family level. So this actually would be one member of the household is utilizing these services. I'm sorry, I probably should have noted that. So this would be kind of a family variable, whereas the wages and employment I can look at the individual level. So another strategy, and actually when I first started this paper, this was the strategy. So a lot of you probably are thinking, while I'm talking about this, well, there's I'm identifying off the time series. There's a lot, you potentially have a lot of concerns there. Things going on in the world at the time when refugees arrive might be influencing this outcome. And I agree. I think it's less of a concern for refugees given the institutional constraints, but there's definitely a reason that you would potentially want to use state level variation as opposed to national variation. Because the advantage you have of state level variation is then you can control for the year of arrival. So I do that, and the problem is when I do this regression, I don't know in my data set how many people are being placed in your family. So if you remember earlier, I was telling you about the Refugee Resettlement Program, how it works. Family is not going to have any bearing on your ability to come into the country based on economic conditions. Like even if you were able to jump to the front of the line, you're still going to be subject to this 18 to 24 months delay in arrival because it's pre-arrival screening. But you could see a potential problem with this using state level variation, because the assumption here is that they're being placed randomly throughout the United States. So they're coming here randomly, or the timing when they come is random, but also the placements within the United States is random. And not knowing who in my data is being placed in your family and who isn't, you could think about, what is the family doing prior to arrival? So this isn't a concern with using the national unemployment rate, because I don't believe that any of these families are returning, or there's any return migration going on. So I don't believe that any of these families, are coming to the United States requesting that their family members come as well. Say their family members get approved 2 or 3 years later. Those people are probably still going to be in the United States. The state level variation, though, you could think about maybe 2 states, Wyoming and New York. So Wyoming is sparsely populated. New York is very heavily populated. There's always going to be some sort of migration from Wyoming to New York, by and large. So during a boom period, you might think that some of the refugees that were resettled in Wyoming might be moving to New York. But you could just, during a bust period, similar to what we're facing right now, you can imagine that gets accelerated. So less opportunity in Wyoming, more and more refugees are moving to New York, so that when their families come, half of those families or half of those people in that cohort are getting placed randomly because they don't have families. But the people that do have families could potentially be getting placed in better areas. And that would, when I'm making a comparison between a booming New York, or refugee arriving in a booming New York versus a refugee that's arriving in a New York that's going through a bust, that comparison is going to be attenuated a bit, because some of those people might be getting placed there because they have family. That's all to say that when I run this regression, so I do this regression, it's similar to the national specification. The only addition is these 2, I'm using state level variation here. And then I added 2 additional fixed effects, the state of arrival and the year of arrival. When I do this, I find that the results are similar, at least for the wages. I don't see much of an employment effect, and I actually see kind of a weird positive effect in the 5th year. And then, if I was to take these results at face value, I would assume that there was sort of a decay in this wage scoring effect. And it would be surprising, because most of the literature shows that this effect, at least for natives, lasts 10, 15 years. When I'm, if I'm to believe these estimates, that effect disappears after the 5th year. So, I've talked about the problems that I have with this regression, but it's not to all say that all is lost with this. Because if you think about, who would be more likely to have family already in the United States? And, the assumption I make in this next regression is, well, maybe the people that are the first to arrive from their origin country, maybe they don't have family. Maybe the pioneers of a particular refugee origin group would be less likely to have families. So what I do in this table is I actually split sample 2 ways. One, I use, if you were if say you were a Somali refugee and you were the first to get placed in Minnesota, then you would be a pioneer, a state pioneer. So in this regression, I'm using, I'm limited the sample to just those that are state pioneers. And I see kind of a similar relationship to what I find when I use the national unemployment rate, but nothing's really, I don't really get a lot of precision in these estimates. I mean, the magnitudes are similar, but I don't have any statistical significance. In the second table, I just limit to if you are a pioneer of your origin country. So here I'm saying, you know, if you're the first Somali ever to come to the United States. And in that case, we see a very strong relationship with wages, much larger magnitude, and also a negative employment. But also similar, you know, it's not much of an effect in the first year. So, you know, both of these samples contain women refugees, so that positive, slightly dull to positive effect might be affected by them. But that's all to say, this is I think that there's definitely a lot of potential in this literature. It was exciting to see last week, you know, more people looking at this. And yeah, so I hope that you know that people continue to research this, because this is a potential area to learn a lot about differences between immigrant groups over time. You can see the latest version of the paper on my website, and feel free for any comments or suggestions. You can email me, and I'm also on Twitter. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Joshua, for the great presentation. So now we have 6 to 7 minutes for question and answer. So whoever wants to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand, and then I'll give you the floor. So please go ahead. Yeah, we're open for questions. Maybe I can ask you the last question that was asked on the chat. Could you use the unemployment rate of migrants to get closer to the true labor market of refugees?
I can't. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, so I have tried a number of ways. So it's hard to get the specific migrants. You can, I mean, using the same formula that the U.S. government uses to come up with the national unemployment rate. You can do that for subgroups, but it starts to get very noisy if you use smaller and smaller subgroups. Probably a better group to compare them to would be, because most refugees don't have U.S. experience, and a lot of the jobs that they take are going to be jobs that are similar, at least the initial jobs that they take are going to be jobs that are similar to high school educated natives. So I have tried this with using just like the college unemployment rate or the high school educated unemployment rate. And I don't really see a lot of differences there. But using I've attempted to create a migrant unemployment rate. It's very noisy, so you know, difficult to say whether or not that would be a good use.
Okay, thank you. I see that Catherine Sommerfeld has the question on the chat. Catherine, do you want to go ahead and ask it out loud?
Sure. Just a second, I'm just turning on my microphone. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, I don't know whether you can hear me. Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So you said that there's interesting things to learn here from the experience of refugees. I would like to add to this the literature which has shown that refugees are different from other migrants because other migrants usually arrive as work migrants. So can you modify why it is important to learn from this group of refugees? Also maybe in comparison to graduates where we have a similar exogeneity of the recession, the business cycle.
So I would say, you know, one of the advantages to using refugees is that you do kind of have a diverse group of people in terms of educational background, and you're able to control. I'm able to control for that on what they have achieved in their home country. So it could be the case that refugees come to the United States and achieve more educational attainment, but what I'm measuring is based on what they achieved in their home country. But broadly, I would say, you know, it's a very fair point. And when I was first presenting this work, everybody was like, well, this is well and good, but, you know, refugees are a subset of migrants. And that's why I would say that there's definitely a need to look, you know, there are probably plenty of immigrant groups that come to the United States that are subject to institutional constraints that would allow them to not be gaming their arrival based on economic conditions. So it was great to see that, you know, Andres' paper last week, you know, starting to explore that. But I would say refugees, you know, it's just part of the puzzle, really. I think, you know, this is going to be important to, particularly for, you know, refugees themselves and people that work with refugees. But I would say broadly, you know, you want to understand this effect across, you know, a broad spectrum of immigrant groups, you know, those that are most vulnerable to those that, you know, potentially have are highly advantaged. So, it's not to say that I think refugees speak for all migrants, but I do think that it adds an important piece to understanding this effect.
Great. And I also actually have a question, since at the beginning you related your question to the literature and the scaring effect when you graduate into a recession. Could you compare a little bit the two effects? And also, we know that there is a wage gap that exists between migrants and natives in normal times. So is this wage gap larger when refugees come into a recession?
So the average effect, I find the employment is different, I think, than what we find with natives. Natives would either observe no effect, or maybe even a slightly positive labor force attachment. The wage soaring effect is, dependent. So I guess it's harder to compare my results to some of the other papers, because some of the other papers are just looking at college graduates. So I guess, in my paper, I also stratify the sample or split up the sample based on education attainment. And what I find is for male college educated refugees, so the comparison between, say, Lisa Kahn's work, which is looking at native college graduates, male college educated refugees see a substantial reduction in comparison. So that, the natives maybe see a 1 to 2 percentage change in their wages. College educated male refugees are looking at 6-7% reduction. So, a much more substantial effect for that group. And, it makes sense too. You can think about, a refugee that's maybe a college professor in his home country coming over here, is not able to find a job, and ends up taking, maybe driving an Uber or something like that. And that happens often. They talk to people, what their educational background was in their country, and it doesn't seem to match well with what the job that they took in the United States. So, particularly in adverse economic conditions, you could see that, male college educated refugees are not able to take advantage of the education attainment they got prior.
Thank you. Just one last question by Jesus. Jesus, do you want to ask it out loud? And then we can move to the next presentation.
I think it says too much noise here.
Okay, so his question is, I would appreciate a quantitative and qualitative comparison with the results presented last week by Andreas. Could this just be Philippines versus Vietnam as origins?
So I don't want to speak too much on, because I haven't had a chance to read Andreas's paper. Just some first thoughts that I had about their work in comparison to mine. One thing I think is very interesting is that they're using family migration. And that is great because it eliminates the problem that I have. I'm looking at a group that some of them are placed with family and some of them are not. So, there's a confounder there. They're looking, as I understand from the presentation, they're looking only at family. So that is interesting. I would say in terms of comparison between the two, it looked like the only big difference was that they didn't observe an employment effect. But you can think about with refugees, this is a very vulnerable group. But also, this is a group that has access to social welfare programs, which other immigrant groups do not. So, some of the potential, decline in labor force attachment might be related to their ability to get benefits. But again, I haven't read the paper, so I can't speak, broadly about how the two differ. But it's interesting. I'm very excited to read it when it comes available.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Joshua. If you can unshare your screen, then we'll leave the floor to Andres.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I think this is an important space, especially on these times. So I hope everybody is safe at home, and thank you for attending this seminar. So I'm going to present today this paper about migration and schooling, in particular under the context of social violence. This is a paper where I am co-author with Jhon Mora from Universidad ICESI in Cali. And actually, we are going to be using data from this particular city. So what was the motivation of this paper and why we decide to use this city in particular? It comes from this particular graph. I hope, even if it's too small, I'm gonna show a bigger one later. But this was a graph that comes in 2016 from The Economist, showing out what were the world's most dangerous cities in the world. For sure, this is a title that no city would like to have. And unfortunately, one of those cities was Santiago de Cali. It was at the bottom. So this created a lot of attention about policymakers, like what was the possible implication and how to improve during this year. So from this graph, there are several important things. One is that there are a lot of Latin American cities in this part. And the second for our case actually is that by 2016, actually the city improved a lot relative to years before. So if we go to 2012, this is the graph for 2012. Actually, well, we will see that things were a little bit even worse. So by this time, Santiago de Cali was not only the second city with the highest homicide rate, but it was also the city with the largest number of homicides. So I was very familiar with this time. This was actually the year before I came to the United States to do my PhD. And when we talk about like possible cases of homicides, you can imagine someone that is maybe walking on the street, and then someone come and try to, I don't know, get your phone, and you deny to give it your phone, then they kill you just because of this. This was something like, it was a moment that it was pretty dangerous. So we know by experience that this is a huge problematic. Now, if we go around the city and analyze each of the districts of the city is divided in 22 districts, we will find that these homicides are spread all around the city. We will find some regions that have a higher number of homicides, especially in the east and the west regions, but mostly all these, but you can also find a higher number of homicides in, for example, District 10, which is a middle income class. So this was a problematic that was spread around all the city by 2012. Now, how this relates with migration? So we know that migration has been a mechanism to stimulate development, in particular at origin migrants country. We have positive effects in several measures of development, like child labor, human capital accumulation, even asset accumulations. But recently there has been this new literature showing that actually the presence of conflict can offset all these positive effects that migration may have. So we have two recent papers showing that under the context of conflict, it is possible to see that, for example, migrants' earnings are used differently. And we have also evidence that actually these migrants' earnings maybe won't be enough, or maybe the migrant won't want to invest in these conflicted areas. And it is easy to imagine that it may be the case that if you think that there is going to be if things are going to get worse in the origin country, then maybe it's not going to be a good idea to invest the money in those particular places. Or if you expect that maybe there is going to be future migration, then probably it is also going to affect how migrants' earnings are going to be used. So here we have a particular setting, because we have a migrant sending city, we have a region which is particularly for Colombia, who receive a big amount of remittances, and we have maybe one of the most dangerous cities on the world. So this is going to be a very nice context to explore what is the relationship between migration and schooling under social violence. So basically, what we will want to do in this paper is explore what is the relationship between migration and schooling. We are going to try to get close to the migration literature, just to try to replicate some results and then see how social violence interact according to this. We are going to focus in school attendance, which has been used in the literature before, but we are going to have we're gonna add educational attainment, which is not very common in the literature. And the second thing that we want to explore is what is the relationship between migration and schooling under the exposure of social violence. We will want to explore a little bit and analyze what will be those potential mechanisms that allow migration to improve educational attainment, and finally see how these potential mechanisms interact under the presence of social violence. So these are going to be what we're going to try to explore in this particular paper. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the preview of the findings in case I cannot go until the end because time restrictions. But the good news is that what we're going to find is that actually children who live in recipient households are going to be more likely to reach higher levels of education. We will find that the effect is more pronounced for girls. This may be good news if you think, for example, in the Flow paper in 2012, which you can see that more educated women translate in better development outcomes. We also going to find that children between 15 and 18 years old are the ones who benefit the most. And this second result may be explained by the fact that during this time, actually, these are the years when children start facing no compulsory levels of education. So probably that will be the reason why they are the ones who benefit the most. Now, interestingly, we are going to find actually that migration improves living conditions for members left behind, but it also going to improve the conditions for those households who are located in regions who are experiencing, or in districts, sorry, who are experiencing a huge amount of homicides. So this is we are gonna try to explore a little bit more about this. We know that the effect in terms of magnitude is gonna be lower for those kids who are exposed to social violence. And here we are gonna measure social violence in two ways. The first one is gonna be a measure of perception, where the household head is asked like, okay, what is your perception about the neighborhood where you live? And the second measure is gonna be more of experience. Like if you live in one of these districts with the highest amount of homicide rates, or if you are gonna be, or if you are victim of any type of crime. And I'm gonna go in detail a little bit about this later on in the presentation. Finally, what we are gonna try to explore a little bit, given the limitation of the data that we have, is what other channels can explain this, the result that we found. And there is gonna be a relationship about migration, right? You expect like future migration, this maybe will affect the return of education, the return of education that you expect. If you expect that the return of education is gonna be lower in a migrant, where the migrant is located, then probably you won't want to invest on education in the home country. So we're gonna explore this around the paper. Let me keep moving forward about the background. So let me show you a little bit about the theoretical background. What do we know about schooling and migration? When you think about migration, you will consider two possible effects. I think the main effect is going to be the income effect coming from migrants' earnings. So there is this evidence that when households receive remittances, there is a reduction in the household budget constraint in the household of the members left behind. And this will reduce the school cost, and with that probably increase human capital accumulation. There is some evidence about this in the recent literature, but there is also two effects that we need to take into account. The first one effect is the disruptive effect created by incentives for future migration, as I was explaining before. If you think that it's not going to be worthy because you are going to migrate in the future, probably you are not going to invest in higher levels of education. Even if you consider that jobs are going to be, there is going to be a mismatch in the future, probably you are not going to do it. And the second one is also the time that parents spend in their children. So we're going to assume here that basically the time that parents spend with their kids, the quality of this time is important in achieving higher levels of education. There is some literature showing this. And this disruptive effect, because one of the parents have to migrate, probably is going to end up affecting also schooling outcomes. And at the end, what you are going to expect is like the final effect that migration may have. It will be positive. You expect that the income effect is going to be enough to offset all these negative effects coming from migration. So this is what we know from the literature. Now, a little bit about the background that we are going to be facing, in particular with this data and in this city. Colombia has experienced a significant out-migration in the 90s. Probably you are familiar with 2 years ago when we were talking about Colombia, the president of Colombia winning the Nobel Prize of the Peace Nobel Prize because signing this truce with the FARC group. This was a conflict of more than four decades, and the 90s was a very, very bad decade for Colombia in terms of this conflict. So we have political instability produced by this. We also have a decline in the price of coffee, which was one of the leading exports products in Colombia, and we have an internal financial crisis also. So all these create like the perfect cocktail for out-migration. So a lot of people live in the 90s. The main result of this out-migration probably is an increase on remittance income. So we have an increase between the 2000 and 2008 about 200%. We know, of course, there was a slowdown of remittances during the financial crisis in 2007 and the Great Spanish Depression, especially because these are the two main destination migrants countries for Colombians. But by 2012, remittances start coming back to the level before the crisis. Now, we're going to be studying Cali, which is actually the capital of the Valle del Cauca region, which is the main recipient region of remittances in Colombia. And we have some, like, the survey asks a lot about, like, what is the frequency, how do you receive these transfers, and how do you use it? So one of the information that we have is that most of these remittances are used in the households for household expenses, like paying rent, buying food, and some help. And we know that around all these households, only 8% of those households report investing in education as the primary use of this money,
Andres?
Yeah.
There's just one question about how much return migration was there after the crisis in Spain.
That's an important question, you know. Not for this paper in particularly, but there is evidence, like mixed evidence. You can find actually that there is an important return in migration to the country, but there is also evidence that show that there has not been like a huge return in flow. So there is mixed evidence. Is like I have this common question, like you take into account Colombia overall, maybe a big percentage of people coming back, but there is not like a source like I can like cite and take this into account.
Yeah. And is there any evidence that this return migration might also depend on the violence? So maybe they don't return to Cali per se because there is a peak in violence, they might go somewhere else in Colombia, for example?
Not that I am familiar with. If people is returning, I will think that people return to their home country. I mean, I even returned to Cali during the last 3 years, even despite the social violence. I will say that despite this, family ties are going to be an important factor. But we are talking about one of these. This is one of the biggest cities in the country. It's the third largest city. We know that Medellin also has problems of violence, which is the second largest city. So I will assume that even if you are returning to the country, you will want to come back to where you can find like a good job opportunity, right? This is probably one of the interesting things that this city has, it is a huge city with very well developed, I will say, but with a huge problematic of social violence.
Okay, just one last question. Is there any evidence of migration from Venezuela to Colombia, especially in the latest year, and is there a potential correlation with social violence?
There is, but again, this paper actually is going to be before all the problematic, all migration of Venezuela. So we are not going to be seeing this shock. I haven't seen evidence showing that Colombians coming back or Venezuelans coming back increase social violence in Colombia. But what I can say is that you may find an important, I don't know what will be the percentage, but you can see more Venezuelans now around the cities. And not only Venezuelans who are coming back to Colombia, but also who are planning to go to maybe Ecuador and they stay in the cities just like doing a scale. So you can see, unfortunately, Venezuelans on the street of Cali, like asking for money, asking for help. It's a very sad situation. But I'm not very familiar with this situation, and I haven't seen papers related studying the relationship between refugees from Venezuela or migrants from Venezuela and the impact on things like crime. So let me keep going a little bit about the background here in Colombia. So it is important to understand, as I say, how is the Colombian education system organized. By 2012, that is the year that we are going to be analyzing, there is going to be dividing compulsory and not compulsory levels. So basically, kids have 1 year of kindergarten and 9 years of basic education, which are going to be compulsory. And once they reach these levels, there are 2 more levels which are not compulsory, which are going to be similar to high school in the United States. And the sad news here is that by 2012, actually the city has the lowest net enrollment rate since 2006. So the city was not even doing good in terms of schooling. And this is important to take into account too. So with this on mind, let me tell you a little bit about the survey we are going to be using. So maybe this is going to clarify a little bit about the context that we're going to be facing here. We are going to use the Employment Life Quality Survey of Cali. This is a survey by 2012. Probably one of the huge limitations that we are going to have is that this is only a cross-section, but still we are going to have a good amount of children. It's going to be 4,247 children, aged 8 to 18 years old. We decide to focus since 10 years old because this is the age where kids start dropping out from school. Now, sorry. To define the migrant household, which is going to be our main independent variable, we are going to use a dummy variable that takes the value of 1. If the household has had members overseas during the last 5 years, and we don't have information if there is a current member overseas, so we are going to use as proxy if the household is receiving remittances bi-weekly or monthly. So this is going to be our main independent variable. Is going to take the value of 1 even if these 2 conditions are happening. Now, the dependent variables, as I said before, we are going to follow the literature. We are going to use attendance, which is basically if the kid report attending school, but we are also going to go to use attainment. And in the case of attainment, we are going to exploit the detailed information that we have about years of education, the highest level the kid has reached, and the grade level. And we are going to build these 7 categories. We're going to have no schooling. Basically, from here, it's important to highlight the 10 to 11 years, which is the high school, when they reach the no compulsory levels of education, and more than 12, which means they complete high school. So these are going to be our 2 main dependent variables. We are going to use as empirical strategy, we have, of course, the endogeneity of remittances. So we need to deal with this. We are going to use a two-state least square for attendance. Basically, we are going to run a linear probability model. The reason why we decide to do this is because this model gives us like 9 first stage statistics. You can compute Anderson and Rubin tests. You can compute Kleinberg F statistics. So it's going to give us a good idea about how good is the instrument. For the case of the attainment, we are going to estimate an IB ordered probability model. We are going to follow very closely McKenzie and Rappaport paper in 2012, 2011 to compare the magnitude of our results. And as I say, the new contribution we want to do is to see how social violence interact in this particular specification. The only difference is that we are going to use a conditional mixed process estimate to do this.
Just one question about the data. Do you have any information on who within the household receives the remittances, or you only have it at the household level?
No, we do have. We know exactly how much each member receives.
Okay.
So for the instrumental variable, what we are going to use is historical migration rate by districts. So the survey is representative at the district level, so we are able to compute this historical migration rate. And here, basically, what we are going to use is to follow the world system theory, which basically migration networks reduce the cost and risk of migrating. So you will expect that households in regions with higher historical migration rate have a higher probability also to have a member who is going to migrate. Now, this specification have a lot of threats for the identification strategy. We know we cannot use these 3 fixed effects because we are going to kill our instrument. So we need to control for all those characteristics that can, at the district level, that can affect the probability to migrate and the probability to reach higher levels of education or to attend school. So to do this, we are going to try to use income distribution to take into account average socioeconomic level in the district, historical schooling levels, which take into account enrollment rates at the primary and at the secondary levels. These are also good proxies of inequality. We are going to use development of infrastructure, the number of primary and secondary schools, and the public budget by district. And something that we are going to add to our specification is the fact that in Colombia, households are classified by a socioeconomic level. So it's a socioeconomic level that goes from 1 to 6, and we are going to use like a socioeconomic level fixed effects. We hope that this is going to take into account all this noisy comment at the district level.
And do you think there could be some data collection problems that are correlated with violence?
I don't think so. I don't think, I mean, it's hard to know. This is the data we have. This data is collected by the Ministry of Labor, so I doubt there is going to be like any problematic. It's a very serious. I think it's something that Colombia has, is that it has like strong institutions collecting the data. So I doubt it's going to be any noise coming from that part. And you will see the questions of migration is a little bit about perception. So it's not like hard to explain like a relationship coming from the question, like a noise coming in the sense that can affect the results. So let me join a little bit about the results that we have. I think I still have a good amount of time. So first, this is the results on attendance. We do not find evidence actually that migration affects school attendance. These results are actually consistent from a previous work that I have with a co-author from the University of Arkansas, Arya Gaddu. This is a paper for Common in Economic Development and Cultural Change, where we do not find any impact of remittance on school attendance. We find that remittances have reduced the likelihood of child labor, but we don't find any relationship with school attendance. And the results here seems to be consistent with what we found from Colombia overall. We find that that girls benefit the most. We find a reasonable F statistic, so it is unlikely that weak instrument are bias our results. In the paper, we also have Anderson and Rubin confidence intervals. So we believe that there is not an effect coming here. Now, in terms of attainment, the story is a little bit different. We find that actually, in particular, we are interested in the last two categories. This is the categories that I was talking before when I was explaining the dependent variables. We find that living in a migrant household actually increases the probability of reaching no compulsory level by 7.7 percentage points, and by reaching high school by 3.6 percentage points, completing high school, sorry. And the magnitude of these estimates actually are similar to what the literature has found. If we compare with the McKenzie and Rappaport paper, this one a little bit lower in terms of magnitude. The good news is that here is positive. So we find evidence that actually heterogeneous effects about migration and schooling. Meanwhile, some people have found negative effects on Mexico. We have positive effects for Colombia. So when we have this, now what we want to do is explore some potential mechanisms behind this. This is the good news that we have at the beginning. And of course, this is consistent with the new economic labor migration investment hypothesis. So we find new evidence that basically migration increase investment on members left behind. Now, we want to explore some potential mechanisms. And in this case, we are gonna explore mechanisms at the individual and at the household level. So at the individual level, we are gonna explore two measures: child labor, right? If you think that child labor and education are perfect substitutes, so we'll expect also a reduction in child labor. We are gonna explore subjective health. So you will think that more like children with better health actually will outperform their peers. So we are also going to explore this. This is a subjective measure, basically like what is the well is good, very good, bad, or very bad for each household member. So we have information about the kids. And at the household level, we are going to follow Franzen and Mazzucato 2014 and basically explore these particular channels. We are going to build an asset index using home ownership, having a car, telephone, and the type of floor material. We are going to use average year of education of all adult household members. We are going to use measures from financial inclusion. We are going to use measures of food security, which is basically if one of the household members couldn't take one of the foods of the 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And we are going to use a subjective measure of wealth, that is, they ask the household head how they think that the condition of the households, and we are going to use a dummy if they answer very good or good. So when we do this for this potential mechanism, this is a similar specification like the one on schooling. The only difference is going to be that the dependent variable is going to be one of these previous indicators. So we do not find evidence at the individual level, but we have some positive effects in terms of subjective wealth and asset index. So those kids or those individuals who are in migrants households score better in terms of the asset index and have a higher probability of report having good health or very good health or good health. So now the question is, okay, so maybe this mechanism may be affecting those households who are in unsafe or exposure to social violence. And as I said before, we are going to define exposure to social violence in 2 ways. First, we're going to have perception. So they ask the household head whether the neighborhood presents presents safety problems. So whether they live in an unsafe neighborhood or not. And like you asked me, like when I lived 2 years ago in Cali, right? You asked me where I live was unsafe. I would say yes, because I was sitting in my home, and then outside people start shooting themselves. So I would say, yeah, maybe yes, maybe no, but we are gonna use this measure. And the second measure is gonna be more related to homicides and to experiencing that social violence. So we are gonna use a dummy variable. Basically, if the household is located in one of these districts with more than 100 homicides, or if one of the household members have been victims of robbery, homicides, kidnappings, physical violence, sexual violence, or extortion. And with this in mind, we are gonna run our specification, dividing by these two groups. What we find actually is that in case of those households who live in unsafe neighborhoods, actually there is a reduction in the magnitude of the coefficients. For the case of the experiencing violence, actually we are gonna see a lower magnitude in the probability of completing high school. So once we have this, we say, okay, so exposure to violence may offset and encumber the positive effects that migrations may have. Now let's see if any of these potential mechanisms actually will be the channel that will be affecting the relationship between migration and schooling under the pressure of social violence. So we run
Andres,
yeah.
Sorry, there are two questions. One is whether we know who stays in the household between the mother and the father, which could actually give very different outcomes in terms of the decision on whether to stay in school. And the second one is how common it is or how easy it is to move to a different district, so that if I receive remittances, I may decide to leave the violent neighborhood and just move somewhere safer.
Yeah, this is actually what I'm gonna talk a little bit later. The first question is an important question. This is something we have been thinking, like even if the household who receive remittances is the mother, or if it is the father, we can explore that. We haven't done it in the paper, but that's a good question. It is also true, like probably if the migrant is sending remittances, now the member left behind can spend more time with the kids, and this will be a positive effect actually in terms of migration. But we haven't explored that in the paper, but it's true. That's a possible channel that we can explore in the heterogeneous effects. Now, we know that migration will be a big issue, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about this at the end of the presentation. So I'm gonna answer that question at the end. Now, notice here, we start trying to exploring maybe there is any different effect of living in a migrant household on these outcomes at the individual and at the household level. And we actually find evidence that show that migration has a positive effect on these regions who are affected by social violence. And this has been also shown in the literature that migration can help to those households left behind to improve their condition relative to in their community. And this may be particularly the case until this. So we do not find evidence that these are the mechanisms probably explaining why unsafe households are doing worse, or why the magnitude is lower. So, but this is what we have in the data, and this is the limitation. So one possible effect, as the question was asking, was, okay, maybe there is a migration channel here. So it is possible that those households who are in this unsafe neighborhood, when they start receiving remittances, they are gonna migrate. And there is no only migration to other districts. As we say, I mean, the violence is, by this time, was spread during those over all the districts. We will expect to go maybe to one of the lowest one is the 22 district, but this is where the higher socioeconomic level. So the thing is, it's going to be like pretty hard unless that you receive a higher amount of remittances just to change you from socioeconomic level. But what may be happening is that people is migrating outside the country. And as I say, if this is the challenge, if you expect that the returns of education maybe where the migrant is, or if you expect to have a job like doesn't match the education that you are getting in the origin country, so this is gonna affect negatively the probability of reaching higher levels of education. Unfortunately, we do not have unfortunately, the only thing that we know is that if a migrant if a person of the household if a person has lived the household in the last 12 months, we do not know if these ones are kids. We do not know if they have lived the household to another country. So what we are gonna do here is simply to try to see if there is a correlation between living in a migrant household and migrating in the last 12 months. Here we cannot use the instrumental variable, of course, because there is gonna be a violation of the exclusion restriction. But what these graphs show is that conditional on observables, these members in migrant household, those households with a migrant member have a higher probability that one of the members live in the last 12 months. So there may be that this is the challenge. It is possible that people is leaving the household trying to escape from this from the social violence.
Andres, you may want to wrap up real quick, so we have 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, yeah, this is the last. I think this is the big conclusion. We find that migration complement government efforts in developing economies. The result in this paper highlight how living in a migrant household increases the likelihood of completing high school. We find that social violence creates a set of conditions that encumbers the benefit of living in a migrant household. And again, this is something important. I think last year I had the opportunity to participate in the Sustainability and Development Conference, and something that we thought is the importance of the goal of promoting peace. So social violence is a threat to sustainable development. We have so many like policy decisions and new like policy in terms of trying to increase sustainability development. But first, we need to deal with how to stop this social violence. So this is what I wanted to present today. Thank you so much. Yeah, we can pass to the round of questions.
Great, thank you very much. So again, if you want to ask a question, please raise the virtual hand, and then I'll give you the floor. Maybe we can start with Ana Montes, who wrote a question on the chat. Do you want to ask it yourself? Anna?
Hi, can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I was just wondering if, I guess you sort of answered this already. I was asking about whether is the historical migration persistent with violence, or if the violence persists over the communes through time, and then that might lead to more migration from these communes. But I guess you talked a little bit about it on the graph, right? Yeah,
I will agree. I think if we can explore it. We have the data, the evolution of violence by district since 2006. So it is possible to see like which regions are actually exposed to violence. This can open to more research ideas. I know there are some initiatives very interesting by Santiago Saavedra in Universidad de Afid, and they have like a special center analyzing crime. So I think there is good information there, in particular analyzing crime from Medellin and Cali. So yeah, we can see it. I am sure that probably, but what we need to understand also is that migration is costly, right? It's not cheap. So it is possible that these districts who present the higher levels of homicides are also regions that are budget constrained to being able to migrate. So there might be a relationship there and that it will be interesting to explore.
Okay, thank you so much.
Antonio Robles, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask if maybe you could exploit the 2018 population census to check for the external validity for Colombia and maybe the historical data using the 2005 census. Thank you.
So using the census of 2018, I think, well, the thing is it's hard to access the census. For my previous paper, I accessed through iPhones. I don't know if the 2018 census is available. I know you can access to the census in Bogota, which right now is kind of hard to go to Bogota. But we can explore other surveys. I know that the Great Household Survey the Quality Life Survey has some measures in social violence. So we could do it by Colombia overall. I'm sure we can. We will do it. I don't know in particular by this paper, but yeah, sure, it is possible.
Great. Thank you very much, Andres. If you have further questions, please feel free to email him or Joshua.